Hey there guys, so today what we're going to be taking a look at is 21 different games running on the FIREBAT A6. This is a Ryzen 7 6800H powered mini PC paired with 32 gigabytes of DDR5 RAM. The system itself doesn't really let you configure your TDP at all, so it's going to run at its default settings, which should still be fine since it seems to be set to a TDP of about 55 watts. So let's jump right on in. So starting off, we're going to be taking a look at Counter-Strike 2 running with the lowest in-game graphics settings, though we aren't using FSR upscaling whatsoever. And with these settings, we get some fantastic levels of performance, with our 1% lows being at 78 and our FPS average of 121. This is not just going to be a very smooth and consistent experience, it's also a high refresh rate gaming experience, which is exactly the kind of thing that you want to see for an esports title like this. Next, I took a look at Hitman World of Assassination running with the lowest in-game graphics settings, and we are using FSR at the quality preset. And like this, the level of performance that we got is perfectly adequate for a title like this. While it's not a high refresh rate gaming experience and those 1% lows are a little disappointing, things really only come down in the most demanding segments, which are the ones where there's a lot of particles, there's a lot of explosions happening. That's really what brings down the performance, and when you're playing the actual game, you don't really run into this at all. So I consider this to be a very playable experience on this specific system. Next, we have Rainbow Six Siege X running with the high graphics settings, and this is at full 100% render resolution, and we aren't using any kind of upscaling whatsoever. And with these settings, we're able to get a very respectable 74 FPS average with 1% lows of 56. While we're not reaching the triple digits here, it's still very adequate levels of performance, and that does mean that you have a little bit of headroom there where if you want to bump up those 1% lows, you can bring down the graphics settings a bit more. Next, I took a look at Company of Heroes 3 running with the lowest in-game graphics settings, and we aren't using any kind of upscaling whatsoever, though physics are set too high. And at these settings, we're able to get a very respectable 61 FPS average with 1% lows of 48. For this type of title, this is a very playable experience, and while visually it doesn't look spectacular, with this level of performance you can actually sit down and get away with playing. Next, I took a look at Mountain Blade 2 Bannerlord running with the medium graphics settings, which is really the most ideal graphics settings because that's where you get the biggest bump in visual quality. And with these settings, we get a respectable 50 FPS average with 1% lows of 39, though it's not ideal. I definitely would have liked to have seen an FPS average of at least 60 with 1% lows that were more in the mid 40s, but we don't quite get that here. But still, that does mean that for the vast majority of the game, you are going to have a very good experience. It's just in those really high demanding situations where there's gigantic armies fighting each other, you would like to see a little bit better performance. Still an overall great result. Now, I also took a look at Shadow of War running with the medium graphics settings, and here you can see that we got an FPS average of 46 with 1% lows of 35. Not exactly the most ideal experience here. Being a single player game, you can get away with playing like this, and you can of course also just bump things down from medium to low, but considering how old this title is, I'm surprised it's this heavy to run. So for sure, not the most ideal gaming experience here. I also took a look at Tiny Tina's Wonderland running with the low graphics settings, so not the lowest graphics settings, but it is low, and no FSR upscaling whatsoever. And while at these graphics settings, we do get a pretty respectable 56 FPS average with 1% lows of 48. That means it's going to be a very playable experience, and thankfully the art style of the game does lend itself to running with lower graphics settings. So not a bad result at all, especially considering that it is a more modern title. And speaking of modern titles, Marvel Rivals just does not perform well on here at all, even with the lowest graphics settings and setting FSR all the way down to the performance preset. You just don't get a consistent enough FPS average and 1% lows for the type of title that this is. I realistically would just never end up playing this game on a system like this. And next is Black Myth Wukong running with the lowest in-game graphics settings, and we are using FSR at a render resolution of 66% with no frame generation enabled. And at these settings, our FPS average of 33 with 1% lows of 28 leave a lot to be desired. Unless you're really desperate to play this title, it's just not going to be a good experience. So it is playable, it's just not going to be great, and I realistically would just say this is a skip. And another scenario like this is Returnal here running with the the lowest in-game graphics settings, and we are using FSR at the performance preset, and we still do not get anywhere near a playable experience. Here are 1% lows of 22 with an FPS average of 34, leave a lot to be desired, and that realistically means that you aren't going to sit here and play this game. Returnal is one of those titles that is just extremely demanding, and it does bring a lot of mini PCs to its knees, so this is no surprise whatsoever. And I also took a look at Red Dead Redemption 2 running with the lowest in-game graphics settings, though the textures are set to ultra, and this is with the Vulkan API. We do end up with an FPS average of 41 with 1% lows of 35. Considering the type of title that this is, it's not a terrible result. You could realistically get through playing the entirety of the game like this. It's not exactly a very fast-paced game, so having a very high refresh rate isn't really a problem. It's just having a consistent one, and that is what you get here. Visually speaking, though, the game itself doesn't look incredible. It still looks pretty great considering it is everything to its lowest settings. Still, I can completely understand if you decide to skip out on this title, specifically because it doesn't really hit the visual quality that you would want. But a great thing about a mini PC like this is that you're able to go back and play older titles at some pretty great graphics settings. Here we have BioShock Infinite running with the ultra graphics settings, and this is at the full 1080p resolution, and we end up with a fantastic FPS average of 71 with 1% lows of 54. So you're able to play this title at essentially better graphics settings than any console could ever do at the time that this game released. And in fact, a lot of PCs at that time just struggled to play this game at the ultra graphics settings. And you're able to do that with a mini PC like this that is really very inexpensive. Next, I also took a look at Gears Tactics running with the lowest in-game graphics settings at 1080p, and we end up with an FPS average of 94 with 1% lows of 76. Realistically, with this title, you could actually just max out the graphics settings and still get a fantastic result. I kind of just wanted to see what the maximum I could get out of this, and it was pretty great. But even at maxed out graphics settings, you're closer to a 60 FPS average, and that's more than adequate for a turn-based game like this. Now, I also ran the Civilization 6 turn time test to see what the performance would be like here. This is really more of a CPU test than anything else, but we got an average turn time of 37.32 seconds. An overall decent result that comes really thanks to that Zen 3 Plus based CPU. Now, I also tried out the classic Alien Isolation running at the ultra graphics settings, and this one's always a spectacular one to take a look at because it runs really well on most systems out there while visually looking really fantastic. And of course, we get a great result with our FPS average of 89 and 1% lows of 67. Really, you can't ask for a better result in this title. Again, a similar scenario as BioShock Infinite, where you're able to play this game at a higher resolution with better graphics settings than any console that was out when this title first released. So you're effectively getting a remastered experience of games that came out in the Xbox 360 and PlayStation 4 eras. Now, I kind of just threw this title in here because it does have a built-in benchmark, but here is Strange Brigade running with the lowest in-game graphics settings at the full 1080p resolution, and we do get an FPS average of 62 with 1% lows of 52. So overall, a great result here, and we are using the Vulkan API, but it's nothing earth-shattering, and I'm sure this is a title that most of you have never even heard of. Now, I did also take a look at Batman Arkham Knight running with the lowest in-game graphics settings, and you can see here that we get an FPS average of 52 with 1% lows of 41, which is a decent result here, though considering the fact that we do have to use the lowest in-game graphics settings, it's not exactly great, but visually speaking, the game still looks great. The difference between the lowest and the highest graphics settings really is not all that drastic visually, but it does seem to have a pretty major impact on the performance. So you can more than comfortably play through the entirety of the game like this without really feeling like you're missing out on almost anything. Of course, I also took a look at Final Fantasy XIV Dawn Trail, and the performance that I got out of this wasn't exactly spectacular, but seems to be more than adequate enough for the type of title that this is. With an FPS average of 42 and 1% lows of 24, it's not great, but considering that this is
is a MMO and one that has a much slower pace to its combat, you can get away with playing like this, and the built-in benchmark itself does say that it gives pretty standard levels of performance, which is technically a passing grade, though nothing spectacular. Now, I also did run the Rift Breaker CPU benchmark, and you can see here that the result that we got isn't exactly spectacular. This is a very demanding scenario in this title, and well, we end up with an FPS average of 37 with 1% lows of 20. Again, a very demanding scenario, but this is a title that you're going to struggle to play if you're trying to go for these really intense scenarios. I, of course, also did Deus Ex Mankind Divided running with the lowest in-game graphics settings, and you can see here that our FPS average of 43 with 1% lows of 31 are playable enough for a single-player title like this, so still surprisingly low. This is a very demanding title. You would be surprised that even for the age that it has, it still is pretty tough to run on a lot of systems. So while it is a playable experience here, you're not going to get anywhere near a high refresh rate gaming experience. And the last game that I took a look at was Grid 2 running with the high graphics preset, and of course the result that we get here is fantastic. We're getting a high FPS average with fantastic 1% lows, and this isn't really all that surprising to see. This title runs extremely well on most hardware out there, and I'm glad to see that we get such a great result here.
And there you have it. The performance of this system is pretty decent, though in a lot of modern AAA titles, it's really going to struggle to get playable performance at all. There are also older AAA titles that still seem to struggle to run on a system like this. So it's not incredible levels of performance, but for the price that you can pick this system up, there really just is nothing else that competes with it. But if you're interested in picking this system up, check out the links down below. I'll catch you guys in the next one.